All right, good evening, everyone. My name is David Krugler, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and also visiting graduate faculty in the Masters of American History and Government program administered by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Tonight, I'm standing in for Dr. John Moser as the moderator for tonight's episode of Documents in Detail. The point of these webinars is to pull together thoughtful scholars and have a conversation about a single document, its words, use of language, meaning, context around it, and importance. You can take part in the conversation by asking questions through the WebEx chat window. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The subject of today's program is Ronald Reagan's 1964 A Time for Choosing speech. And to help discuss it tonight are Dr. Stephen Knott, who is Thomas and Mabel Guy Professor of American History and Government at Ashland University, and also Professor of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College. Steve is the author of numerous fine books, including two on the Reagan presidency, a history of the George W. Bush administration, and two works on what I believe is still your favorite subject, right, Steve? Alexander Hamilton.
That's correct, David.
Great,
Absolutely.
great. Thank you for joining us, Steve. Along with Steve, we have Gregory Schneider, Dr. Gregory Schneider, who is also honored visiting graduate faculty in the MAG program and professor of history at Emporia State University. He has published numerous books as well, including several significant titles on modern American conservatism. These works include studies of the Young Americans for Freedom, a reader on American conservatism, and his most recent book was a study, a very well received study of the demise of the once fine railroad, a mighty fine line, the Rock Island Railroad. Thanks for joining us tonight, Greg.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
Great, great. Well, I'd like to start tonight by splitting the question to you both, either Greg or Steve, if you would like to tell us the context of the speech. Help us see Reagan delivering the speech in his time, what's going on with Goldwater's campaign, the major election issues, um, and the status of American conservatism and liberalism. And then the split question for the other will be, where was Ronald Reagan at in his life, in his career, and in his politics in 1964?
Well, if Greg doesn't mind, I'll jump in first.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Um, this speech was one of the few highlights from an absolutely dismal Goldwater campaign. Um, I would say that this was probably one of the more poorly run Republican presidential campaigns in modern times, with the possible exception of Bob Dole's run for president back in 1996. Now, granted, Goldwater had a steep hill to climb in terms of challenging the successor to the beloved John F. Kennedy, who had been killed less than a year early, murdered in Dallas, Texas. But the Goldwater campaign did not help itself on a number of occasions. Part of Barry Goldwater's problem was that he was remarkably frank and candid, which is perhaps an attribute, but in the modern media age can get you into trouble. So he was constantly on the defensive in terms of comments about the use of nuclear weapons and comments about Social Security that got him into trouble. So one of the few bright notes, one of the few highlights of that Goldwater 1964 campaign was the so-called speech, later known as The Time for Choosing, delivered by a Hollywood actor by the name of Ronald Reagan, who had yet to begin a political career. And this speech, which was broadcast live from Los Angeles, I think a week or two, I may be off on that, but a few weeks prior to the election, generated a massive response from conservative and from Republican donors from around the country. It raised somewhere in the vicinity of $8 million for the Goldwater campaign but perhaps more importantly, it put Ronald Reagan on the map as a potential political figure himself, and it brought Reagan to the attention of a number of conservative benefactors who would then fund his 1966 campaign for governor of California and his later presidential run in 1976 and 1980. So in terms of its significance, this was the transition for Ronald Reagan from being a Hollywood B-list actor to being a kind of A-list political figure on the American political scene.
And I would add to that, Steve and David, that I think that the Reagan had been giving kind of variations of this speech for almost a decade by that point to General Electric audiences that he traveled and talked, as he called it, on the mashed potato circuit when he was host of GE Theater. And one of the influential people at GE, a public relations man by the name of Lemuel Ware, was fairly conservative. And Reagan, who was still a Democrat, and he remained a Democrat into the early 60s before he switched parties to the Republican Party. And he kind of speaks to that in the speech, certainly, was becoming very conservative, especially on taxes and other issues. As an actor, of course, his revenue was hit hard by the 90% rate that was then in vogue at the top income levels. And so he spoke of that in the speech. He gave a kind of distillized version of this very speech almost every time he gave a talk for General Electric. And so this was something that he was used to delivering. And of course, with his Hollywood abilities, he delivered it very effectively, very well on national TV. And lots of people thought they had, a candidate who could be of some importance in the future. There's no doubt.
Thank you both. I think that's quite significant for us to know that this was not Reagan's first time delivering the speech. We know that he was an accomplished speaker, obviously, given his career at that point. But this is something that he had delivered quite a lot, and kind of belies what he says at the beginning, that there's not really a script here. In fact, as Greg tells us, it kind of was a script. The big question I'd like to ask to get us into the document itself is this. What makes this speech so special? And Steve kind of hinted at the answer here to the next question I want to ask that's related. Why are we talking about this speech rather than one by Lyndon Johnson or Barry Goldwater, the two candidates in 1964?
I'll go ahead first on that. I mean, you could look at Goldwater's convention speech in '64, where he kind of fails to give an olive branch to the liberal Republicans who had, failed to rally around him after he won the Republican nomination after winning the California primary in June of 1964. People like Nelson Rockefeller and William Scranton, who was then governor of Pennsylvania, were not people who were on the side of Goldwater. And Goldwater doesn't try to kind of heal the breach that was widening in the party, as many of those Republicans would support Lyndon Johnson in the fall. Instead, he gives a great speech, great in historical importance because conservatives loved it. It's red meat, with the famous lines, of course, liberty and extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice was no virtue. Coming a few months after the extremist act of Lee Harvey Oswald assassinating the president of the United States, to kind of identify yourself with extremism is a bit of a problem. But the speech had rang some strong resonance with the conservative wing of the party, which was not in and of itself big enough, of course, to win elections, as it would become a little later in the 1980s and afterwards. So the conservative movement loved what Goldwater had said, and that speech still certainly has some resonance in the campaign. Lyndon Johnson was a terrible speaker, as you well know, and so Lyndon Johnson was never one to give a good delivery of speeches, even though he had good speech writers. Richard Goodwin and others who wrote speeches for him were very fine and wrote some good words. But Reagan, with his ability to convey conservative principles, which he did very effectively in the speech, much better than Goldwater had in the campaign, again, is a sign of perhaps the Republicans had picked the wrong candidate, that they would have preferred to have somebody of Ronald Reagan's ability as a communicator at least his ability of delivery, over Goldwater in 1964. And the two men don't really get along that effectively afterwards. There's a strained relationship that exists between Goldwater and Reagan for a while after this, because I think Goldwater recognizes Reagan's abilities very well, but we can talk about that too later.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Greg. Steve, did you want to weigh in
Sure.
on this question?
Yeah, just a few points to add to Greg's fine points that he mentioned. That convention where Goldwater was nominated was held in San Francisco, which is hard to believe if you think about it today. I guess San Francisco was a different place in 1964. But anyways, um, it was a media disaster in the sense that, as Greg mentioned, Goldwater was either unable or unwilling to sort of heal the rift between himself and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, both of whom were seen as moderate to liberal Republicans. But to make matters worse, the media attention, the television attention on that convention conveyed a kind of, for lack of a better term, extremist image to the American public. There was one point, and I forget who the speaker was, it might have been Goldwater himself, where a good portion of the crowd sort of turned towards those booths where, you know, David Brinkley and Chet Huntley were sitting, you know, shaking their fists at the media folks. Now, we may all sympathize with that sentiment, perhaps, but it just came off as kind of an angry, again, to use the term extremist gathering, where there was no, in the perception of many, no genuine effort to sort of heal the wounds in the party, and those wounds, by the way, were deep. The other thing I would mention, and Greg touched on this as well, Lyndon Johnson was he was not a good speechmaker. He did not come off well on television, but the American public still had that image of John F. Kennedy in their mind, this attractive, young, tanned, eloquent speaker. And Johnson, in a way, was sort of smart. He kind of limited his television exposure, whereas Goldwater, being the challenger, had to take advantage of as much TV time as he could get. And as Greg mentioned, he just did not come off all that well on television. Now, having said all that, I do think it's true that the media, particularly the television networks, were, in a sense, gunning for Goldwater. And they bought the Johnson administration's line that if you elected Barry Goldwater, you were risking nuclear war. And if you elected Barry Goldwater, you were risking a full-blown conflict in a place called South Vietnam. So,
in fact, there was a joke that went, they told me if I elected Barry Goldwater, we would be at war in South Vietnam. I voted for him and we are, or something. If they told me if I voted for Barry Goldwater, we'd be at war in South Vietnam, I did, and we are a year later. So.
Right. Yeah, and as we now know, Lyndon Johnson was waiting to make some drastic moves in Vietnam until after the election. That planning was already in place, even before Reagan speaks. Well, let's focus now on the choices that Reagan speaks of, and then we've got a question from Larry that I'll bring up, and I'd like to set up our consideration of the choosing Reagan is putting before the American people by reminding us that Lyndon Johnson was running on a platform of the Great Society. He had said earlier in the year, "We are a rich and powerful nation, but we are not yet a great nation." And for Johnson and American liberals, that meant expansion of the New Deal administrative state and anti-poverty programs and more support for education and urban renewal, Medicare as well. This helps us understand how Reagan frames the choices. But how does he set up the choosing? What's powerful about his presentation and his style?
I think what's really interesting is on the third paragraph right away. I mean, he sets up the fact about how much spending and the kind of falsity of the prosperity we're living in in the current day. And I was reading this, like rereading this earlier today, and it's like today 37 cents of every dollar earned in this country is a tax collector's share, and that our government continues to spend 17 million a day, more than it takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 20 out of the last 34 years. We have raised our debt limit 3 times the last 12 months. I thought I was reading about this past couple of years, in terms of, the same problems that we're dealing with today, past an era in which conservatives have had control of the political climate in Washington, including under Reagan and including under George W. Bush and as well as conservative Congresses. And yet we're dealing with the same phenomenon, which shows you in some respects that the power of the New Deal / Great Society administrative state is much better politically able to absorb and to win converts than, let's say, the conservative principles which oppose it. So that's been a dilemma certainly conservatives have been fighting since. That, as well as his kind of laying out, talking about agriculture, which nobody really talks about anymore, but talking about it as a, in essence, a right for the farmer to own his own property and to manage his own affairs instead of being intruded on by government. I mean, these are things that he mentions. He mentions the urban crisis in a way, but he mentions it in terms of urban renewal, which the Great Society would, of course, engage in a forthright manner. So, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting, instead of laying out a tax issue entirely, which you would think Reagan would do given his history later on as president, he lays out a couple of examples of domestic problems and spends less time on foreign policy than you would think he would too. So I'll leave that. I'll just throw that out and leave it to Steve too.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Greg just said and add, I too was surprised, and I've read this speech a few times over the years. I used to work on the Ronald Reagan Oral History Project, so the speech, or A Time for Choosing, was always mentioned by almost every single person we ever interviewed. And the lack of foreign policy context is always a surprise to me. It may well have been that the whole nuclear question and the whole Goldwater joking about lobbing an ICBM into the men's room of the Kremlin just made that issue so toxic that both Goldwater and Reagan, as the campaign drew to a close, just stayed away from it. The other thing I would like to add is back to David's question about what was the choice, in a sense, here. I think Reagan, somewhere near the beginning of the speech, refers to there is only an up or a down. There is no such a thing, and I'm paraphrasing here, this notion that we have to choose between left and right, he dismisses. There's really a choice here between up or down. Up to man's age-old dream, the maximum of individual freedom consistent with order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism. I think Reagan, in a sense, I'm not sure when his close relationship with William F. Buckley began, but I think he was one of those original or close to charter subscribers of National Review. I think he had read excerpts of some of Friedrich Hayek's work in Reader's Digest and perhaps in Human Events. Reagan had really accepted the sort of, I guess, what they call the Vienna School of Economics or whatever, that the social welfare programs that had begun with Franklin Roosevelt and accelerated under Lyndon Johnson were sort of the first steps on the path to totalitarianism in the United States. They were the road to serfdom, as Hayek referred to it. So I just think it's interesting that Reagan chose to highlight that, and that certainly was a massive dividing line between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. The role of government in terms of creating a so-called Great Society, in terms of regulating the economy and the creation of the administrative state, a major divide between the two sides.
Okay, thank you both.
And Reagan was very familiar with the intellectual conservative writings of that era. So certainly familiar with, I mean, you had, in the early 60s, you had Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom come out, which was a group of speeches in the late 50s, which Reagan would have been very familiar with. I think Steve's right. He had read Hayek's Serialized, but probably read Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. He was a subscriber to National Review already, though I don't think, I've looked at the Buckley correspondence, I don't think they had started writing yet. Buckley correspondence with Nancy Reagan is actually funner because Nancy Reagan is like a gushing fan of William F. Buckley. So it's kind of interesting to read in the 60s when she's the governor's wife. late 60s. But in that sense, he's very much in the milieu of what would become, or what was becoming to be, the conservative movement, which is starting to form in earnest. But there's no policy think tanks. There's no real sense of ability to get proposals like privatizing Social Security into action and law. That would come later.
One thing that strikes me in reading the speech and listening to your thoughts on the choosing, in many ways, Reagan is being a neo-Hoover here. I mean, you hear echoes of Hoover's ordered liberty
Yeah.
and in his criticisms of the New Deal in the 32 campaign, and then as a spokesperson for the Liberty League. And I wonder if Reagan had read these speeches of Hoover. Certainly, Reagan was savvy enough not to bring Hoover's name up, since he had a tattered reputation even in the 1960s. But having read these conservatives, there's this bedrock to his ideas here, and the way he sharpens the distinction between conservatism and liberalism.
Yeah, certainly going back to the founders, which he does, fits within that context, as Hoover did as well in the 30s. But I'm sure Reagan, remember, was a New Dealer, so he probably would have poo-pooed the conservative Hoover during the 1930s, but certainly not by the time of 1964, which is the year, I think, if I'm not wrong, Hoover died, if I'm not mistaken, that year. But certainly would still not have brought him up. But I think that the ordered liberty conception is very much ingrained in the kind of thinking of the National Review crowd in the 1950s, and especially by the late 50s, when Frank Meyer, who was an editor there, proposes a kind of a wedding between classical liberal ideas and traditionalism, which is kind of problematically called fusionism, which becomes the basis for the formation of conservative political movement. And Reagan's very much in that vein.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So let me share with you all a question we received through the chat feature from Larry, who writes, I noticed that we see some hints of the Reagan to come in this speech. His use of anecdotes, for example, and Larry mentions the anecdote of a mom scamming the welfare system. And Larry asks, how accurate was Reagan in saying that 37 cents on the dollar went to the federal government? Weren't tax rates higher actually under Eisenhower? And did farmers want to end the farm program? And just to broaden Larry's question, since Reagan does cite a lot of statistics and numbers and facts, has the speech been fact checked? How accurate were Reagan's figures here? We would think that since he'd been giving this speech in public settings and as a corporate spokesperson for a while, that it had been thoroughly vetted.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, both
Yeah.
from Larry and David. I'm not an expert on farm policy. Perhaps Greg is, sitting out there on the prairie. He can confirm whether we're 37 cents per dollar went to the federal government, and other questions about farm programs. But look, Reagan, both as governor of California during the speech in 1960, his speeches in 1964, and then, of course, later as president, did have a tendency to regurgitate the latest factoid that he might have come across in National Review or Reader's Digest or Human Events. And I think frequently these facts were misguided. However, he also had an ability, particularly I think when he was president, to deflect reporters and critics who might go after him on the details, partly through his ability to use humor, partly through his sort of aw shucks, I'm your national grandpa or national granduncle kind of demeanor. But look, this is not a guy who was noted throughout his entire public career for being a master of detail. In fact, he kind of recoiled in terms of reading briefing books while he was president, although he did do his homework. But this is not a man who's known for his ability to digest vast amounts of information and regurgitate it accurately. So I would guess there might be things in this speech that if you had a more vigorous sort of fact-checking media, although in a way Goldwater was subject to that, you might find specific examples of where Reagan was off the mark.
At least he didn't tweet it, which is a plus. No, I mean, I don't have anything else to add to that, really. I don't know for a fact if he's right on this. What's a little more interesting, remember, and Larry referred to Eisenhower's taxes were higher. The taxes were raised, I think, during World War II, it was 93% on the highest level incomes over $100,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken. So Reagan would have been victimized by this. Any additional movie you make, is going to be 93 cents out of the dollar going over 100,000 going to the federal government. This is what Reagan would later claim turned him into Republican. It's Kennedy that cuts taxes, and Kennedy does it in many respects because the economy is floundering. It's an economic growth argument, as Brian Dimitrovich and Larry Kudlow have written in a fantastic new book about the Kennedy tax cut. It's really kind of a supply side cut. Not that they call it that, not that there's any kind of details about this in the kind of lingo of the day, but it's very much a growth-oriented tax cut, which Reagan would later be fond of, right, in the late 70s and early 80s. But you have to remember too that the Republicans and the conservative movement really wasn't operating on those premises then. So Reagan doesn't say anything really about a tax cut. He doesn't say anything about what to do about this. He just says people should be able to keep more of their money. Farmers should be free to choose what to do with their crops rather than to give to the federal government or have the federal government control their power and the prices they set. So I think what that refers back to, if I'm not mistaken, is a 40s case, Wickard versus Filburn, that occurred in the Truman administration, which farmers had their land seized for, I'm forgetting the details. I didn't brush up on my agricultural history before this tonight, due to violating what they were growing on acreage allotments and the like. So, I mean, that could have been a trope that conservatives would have used as a basis for arguing these sorts of things in the 60s as well. But there probably was something closer to that, like Steve said, had come out of one of his favorite publications, no doubt.
And let me add, politically speaking, Reagan's use of anecdotes, his use of humor, made him a very attractive candidate. Both Jimmy Carter in 1980 and Walter Mondale in 1984, both of them thought they could defeat Reagan in those televised debates by marshaling all their facts, which particularly in Carter's case was true, and run circles around Reagan in terms of just mastery of detail, whereas Reagan tended to rely on anecdotes and humor, and arguably speaking, defeated Carter in the 80 debates. He had a terrible first debate with Walter Mondale in 84, but came back with, again, anecdotes and deflated the whole age and senility issue through the use of a joke. So I want to make it clear, even though Reagan was not a master of detail, his ability to connect with the public through anecdotes and sort of off-the-cuff stories was extremely effective.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that in this speech. I mean, on page 3, he's criticizing a proposed Great Society program. I think he's referring to the Job Corps, though he doesn't mention it by name.
Right.
But he refers to the Civilian Conservation Corps, so making that New Deal connection. And he says, if you do some arithmetic, we find that we are going to spend each year just on rooms and board for each young person that we help, $4,700 a year. We can send them to Harvard for $2,700. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that Harvard is the answer to juvenile delinquency.
Not with
That's
Timothy
classic.
Leary there at the time, right?
Right.
By the way, Reagan's jokes used to drive Gorbachev crazy, partly because he would repeat the same anti-communist, anti-Soviet jokes over and over again, to the point where it really got under Gorbachev's skin. But anyways, Reagan loved jokes.
Yeah, there was one exchange, I think, when they were announcing a treaty to reduce intermediate nuclear arms in Europe, where Reagan kept, and he said this all the time when Gorbachev was president, that as Stalin used to say, trust but verify, and Gorbachev says, you always say that, and Reagan has the perfect comeback. He just says, I like it, and then just proceeds to read his speech. So he, even when he's called out on his humor, he's able to disarm.
But there's one thing too to add. I mean, while he doesn't master detail. Obviously, the Iran Contra matter, he was the John Tower Commission report, which revealed that Reagan was in charge, but he's not in charge. That he wasn't running the ship effectively. That the National Security Council was basically running a shadow government of some respects, and chided Reagan for not knowing more what was going on in his own executive branch. But Reagan wrote this speech, and he used cue cards. He didn't use written out. He didn't read from it, so he was a trained actor. So he used cue cards to deliver most of his speech. Little 5x8 cue cards that he had that had key elements on it that he would use to refresh and look down and be able to remember what the details were. And he was somebody who was, he's not given enough credit for his intellectual abilities. He wrote letters, abundant letters, throughout his both political career and even before that. And some of those letters have been published, and they're fantastic. I mean, he writes letters to the common people. He writes letters to people who would write him at the White House. He writes letters to political leaders, and he knows the issues, or at least he knows his view of the issues, and he's willing and he's able to articulate that very effectively. And so this helps him, I think, with the American public. He might not know everything well, but he knows a few things very well. And the few things he knew very well, certainly by the 80s, certainly seemed to work in his administration. Here, he's trying to sell Goldwater, and it's a tougher sell. Selling Reagan proves to be an easier sell for him.
Selling Goldwater brings to mind a quote that Goldwater made after he was wiped out by Johnson in the '64 election. Goldwater said something to the effect of, if I believed everything that I read and saw on TV about me, I wouldn't have voted for me either. So, but, it does help. Ronald Reagan had the ability to sort of slough off media criticism. Barry Goldwater did not seem to have that ability. And it really is important to, I think, keep in mind the Kennedy impact here, Kennedy's mastery of television. And when Republicans saw Ronald Reagan deliver this speech, they thought, there's our guy. He doesn't have the same kind of television charisma that Kennedy had. He's not Dick Van Dyke, but he's our sort of friendly uncle or perhaps grandpa that we can all trust, and he knows how to deliver a speech effectively. Barry Goldwater did not.
It is interesting to note that in a speech delivered on behalf of Barry Goldwater's campaign, when Reagan speaks directly to Goldwater's qualifications, he doesn't talk about how Goldwater will return purchasing power to the American consumer or reduce the tax burden. He talks about Goldwater's personal attributes, that he's an honorable man, and he cites example after example in which Goldwater has been a model employer, a decent person, has used his own resources to help returning veterans. But there's very little in the speech that talks about what Goldwater will do as president, as Greg put it so nicely. Reagan is much better at selling himself than he is Goldwater. And that brings me to the next question I'd like to ask you guys. Without reading too much of what's to come for Ronald Reagan after this speech, does the speech still offer a glimpse or perhaps even vision of Reagan's principles and priorities once he decides to fully enter public life and run for elected office?
In one sense, no, and we've sort of already touched on this. Greg touched on it, and that is the absence of any lengthy discussion of foreign policy. There is a discussion, of course, of the Soviet Union. There is the reference to the ant heap of totalitarianism. It's a hawkish, obviously, view of of the Soviet Union. But Reagan at this time, and this is not quite appreciated, and this is a distinction between Reagan and Goldwater. Reagan abhorred nuclear weapons. Reagan, even at this early date, in fact, long before 1964, was thinking about the abolition of nuclear weapons. That was not a priority for Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater saw nuclear weapons as just another weapon, in a sense. And thus you get these sort of casual, off-the-cuff remarks from Goldwater talking about the potential employment of tactical nukes in South Vietnam and lobbing an ICBM into the Kremlin men's room. That's not the kind of stuff you ever get, or you don't see it as much in Ronald Reagan. This is a man who hated the idea of nuclear weapons, who hated the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, which of course was the doctrine that Lyndon Johnson's presidency was operating under. So I did just want to point that out in the sense that there's not a glimpse in this speech of what was arguably the most a passionate issue for Ronald Reagan. And of course, conservatives will find this out when he becomes president and pursues some of the most far-reaching nuclear accords with the Soviet Union, a country he referred to as the evil empire.
I also think he uses kind of the um, interestingly, I mean, he's talking about accommodation, and he's critical of the accommodation with communism. I believe he mentions in South Vietnam. And this would have been kind of coming from the National Review wing of conservatism. James Burnham, who was an editor there, had written extensively about accommodation with communism, of the problems of containment and these sorts of things. But Goldwater in 64 and earlier is talking about victory over communism. So Goldwater's the kind of hardliner in 64 on the Cold War. Reagan not yet there in full bore when it comes. I mean, he's talking about accommodation. He's talking about the evils of that. He's not really talking about victory over communism in this speech at all in 64. However, on the domestic side, I think as Larry has mentioned, and probably others too, when you're talking about certain social programs and other things of that sort, like the infamous welfare queens remark, which gets Reagan into some hot water in 1980 about a Chicago woman who's living off of welfare and basically ripping off the system. There's a bit of that in his discussion about, Social Security and the people who are ripping off that system in 1964. There are themes that run throughout this. I mean, the example of the GI, kind of similar to Reagan's example in his first inaugural of the World War I veteran who didn't exist. But these are effective. They're relational. They make people relate to the person that he's talking about in a very effective way. And then towards the end of the speech, he uses Roosevelt's line. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny, he says. We will preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we will sentence them to make the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. I mean, he would come back to rendezvous with destiny in his presidency. This is something that stuck very effectively and very clearly with him, of course, reversing it the way I guess Roosevelt reversed the meaning of the forgotten man in the 30s from William Graham Sumner's original conception of the idea.
Yeah. Let's not forget there's also the reference to something along the lines of the doctor's fight against socialized medicine is also your fight as well.
Right.
So here we are in 1964, and of course this had been an issue throughout the 20th century, with the Republican Party drawing the line in terms of its opposition to national health care.
Right, and he does connect the domestic side to foreign policy in that passage Greg mentioned, which comes toward the bottom of page 4 if you're using a printout. Reagan says, "Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us that they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation." I think it's interesting. Again, we see Reagan repurposing durable messages from previous presidents. Peace without victory, of course, Woodrow Wilson's famous call for the United States to help broker an end to the First World War before it was even fully in the war. Reagan's using it in a much different way here. On the subject of the Cold War, um, to what extent is Reagan offering an original call for victory in the Cold War? As you guys mentioned, Goldwater is bringing this up too, but it's Eisenhower and Dulles who are talking about the moral bankruptcy of containment in '52 and the need to take on rollback and liberation. Since Eisenhower hadn't done that, is this and he had been criticized by so many on the conservative side of the Republican Party. Is this another sort of veiled jab at Eisenhower republicanism? That they hadn't fulfilled that the promise of the new look in 52?
Well, I don't think it's so much about Eisenhower republicanism as the kind of waffling. I mean, this is after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is after the perceived, um, you know, the issues Kennedy had with Khrushchev, certainly in the early 60s. The Soviets are on the move in the early 60s. You have anti-communist groups, very radical groups like the John Birch Society, the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade. Reagan had spoken to that organization actually, in I believe in Orange County, which was televised in the early 60s. I mean, Reagan is kind of making his way through he's a strong anti-communist, there's no doubt, but that doesn't come across very effectively in his speech, is what I'm trying to say. And it seems like we're at a period of growing danger in the Cold War. The early 60s would be kind of a high point of Cold War tensions, much like the early 80s would be when Reagan was president. I don't think it's so much a stab against Eisenhower. The conservative movement doesn't like Ike, certainly. I'm not sure Reagan's one of them. I don't think it's so much as a kind of a blow against Dulles' policy for not going the distance on this, as the ineffectiveness of containment as a whole. Yet what would Reagan do in the Cold War, in his presidency? He would implement containment in a different way. George Kennan never liked Reagan's emphasis on, the early part of his administration, but in the end, that pressure worked to help produce Gorbachev and lessen the tensions in the Cold War.
Just to build on what Greg said, and perhaps disagree slightly, it is true that one of the objections that sort of the Taft wing of the Republican Party had towards Eisenhower during the 50s was this sense that this whole sort of rollback doctrine was abandoned. And of course, the Hungarian uprising of 55, 56,
56.
56, thank you, seemed to confirm their worst fears. And it did, Goldwater paid, as the Republican nominee in 1964, Goldwater paid a courtesy call to Ike at his farmhouse at Gettysburg, but it was not a particularly warm get-together. And I think the negotiations to even pull that off were particularly strained. Mm-hmm. So, to some extent, and Greg was absolutely correct, for a hawk on foreign policy, the Kennedy administration was Exhibit A in terms of not following through on the Bay of Pigs and other, actions that were seen as appeasing. But I think many conservatives did factor Eisenhower into it, and particularly never forgave him for what they viewed as the betrayal of Hungary.
Thank you. So we have a question from Dennis, who asks, do you detect any similarities between the time for choosing speech and Jimmy Carter's crisis of confidence speech from the summer of 1979 in terms of concentrating on Americans' confidence and traditional values?
Well, Greg, you just defended Jimmy Carter, I understand. So why don't you?
Well, I think my view of Carter, yeah, I did that Saturday, right? I'm close to it. That had to do with the Iran hostage issue. Okay. I think Carter is, the crisis of confidence speech is a moralist address. It's Carter as kind of preacher in chief in a way, but he does document certainly some concerns about where America's headed, especially in the energy issue and these sorts of things, and it's pessimistic. So it's a darker speech. It's more akin, I think, to Goldwater's address in '64 than Reagan's. Reagan is not so much selling. Might be talking about confidence as a renewal of American principles based on competition, based on a free market economy, based on limited government, based on the founding principles which the conservative movement is pushing in the early 1960s. And so I think Reagan, the difference between the two speeches, I think, is just that. Carter's is very pessimistic, very much in a Jeremiad against the problems of the day and blaming the American people for the problems that are facing them. Reagan's blaming the failure of government and its growth as one of the key issues of our time, why we need a choice, not an echo, as Phyllis Schlafly would write in '64 as well.
And I would just add, and those are great points made by Greg, that in terms of a difference between the Malaise speech and A Time for Choosing, um, Jimmy Carter was all about compassion. He repeatedly spoke, both as a candidate but also as a president, about making the federal government as compassionate as the American people were. Um, Not that Ronald Reagan lacked compassion, but Ronald Reagan viewed the government as the problem, as he said in his first inaugural address. I think Jimmy Carter, even though he was more conservative than Ted Kennedy and other liberals within his own party, Jimmy Carter believed in an activist government that engaged in federally sponsored acts of compassion, for lack of a better term. That's not Ronald Reagan.
And I think another difference too in that speech, as you guys mentioned, Carter comes across as speaking down to the American people, and Reagan, in A Time for Choosing, as well as in his first inaugural and farewell addresses, uh, speaks to the people and praises the people. He speaks of heroes in his inaugural address and says, "You are the heroes." You know, if you're at a counter just doing a transaction, there's heroes on both sides. So you have that market difference there.
Sure.
Uh, well, since we're talking about differences between Reagan and Carter, or other presidents too, for that matter, in his farewell address, Reagan mentions that he was dubbed the Great Communicator. Are there any features in A Time for Choosing speech that show his promise as a communicator? We've touched on some of these: his adept use of humor, use of concrete stories, even if there are unverified details or even factual inaccuracies, to make these problems seem real. What else shows Reagan to be a great communicator in this speech, and a master rhetorician?
Reagan also added in that speech, David, that I don't think I was a great communicator. I communicated great things and great ideas. So, I mean, he even was humble enough to eschew the label in some respect of him being a great communicator. And if you watch the progression, I mean, if you watch A Time for Choosing, which is easy enough to find on YouTube, Reagan's very serious of purpose in the speech. He delivers it very seriously. It's not, he doesn't have the kind of warmth that he would have in his presidency when he delivered speeches, not the, you know, not the kind of there you go again stuff that he did at the debates. I mean, it's a serious purpose. He's going to lay out what the liberals stand for and what, or Democrats stand for, and what the Republicans and conservatives stand for, in a very profound way. But as you watch him go along, I mean, he tends to become better and better at the softer sell in a way. And I mean, this speech has all of the themes. We've talked about him already: his use of other presidents' lingo, his ability to tell stories, his ability to kind of use some details and maybe leave it to the audience to decide whether they're true or not. I mean, those are all very effective things. But he's much more effective, I think, in his presidency because he's got experience in dealing with the kind of big speech. This is a very effective speech, there's no doubt, but I think it's a different type of speech than the ones he would give later on in his presidency. And I think he's right. It's the ideas that he communicated which mattered more than the way he did it, I think.
Yeah, I would just build on that by saying I actually watched this speech. I'd seen it before, but in preparation for tonight, I took another look at it, and I have to say, I actually think it reads a heck of a lot better than it comes off in terms of watching. And to just build on what Greg said, this is not your folksy Ronald Reagan. There's a kind of scowl here, and it surprised me, and it made me wonder: did Reagan learn from the Goldwater debacle that sort of scolding puritanical conservative simply does not sell? But if you can present a kind of sunny, optimistic view, Reagan loved to quote Thomas Paine, of all people,
Yeah.
that we have it in our power to make the world over again. I guess there's some of that in this speech, but boy, when you watch this speech, there's not a smile I don't recall anywhere along the way. That's not the Reagan I expected to see, or that we certainly saw when he became president. Again, I don't know if he learned from the Goldwater debacle or if this was a 53-year-old Ronald Reagan in 1964 64 as opposed to somebody about to enter his 70s when he becomes president, if he just kind of mellowed as an older man. But it surprised the heck out of me. The other thing, if I could just mention quickly, Reagan also said near the end of his presidency he did not understand how anyone who had not had acting experience could become president of the United States. So Ronald Reagan certainly learned over time, I think, to become a more effective, folksy communicator.
You know, it reminds me of Eisenhower's statement that God help this country if it ever has a president who doesn't know as much about the military as I do. So you have these two presidents refracting the preparation for the presidency through their own long established and successful careers. Well, um, another question I wanted to ask related to how Reagan builds his message and carries out his persuasion. And we have touched upon this, but I think it's worth exploring fully. Um, how effectively does Reagan use historical references in this speech, as well as in the corollary documents, the first inaugural and his farewell address? As was mentioned earlier, Reagan was um, reading and educating himself as he became the citizen politician.
Go ahead, Greg.
I mean, I think he uses. You have to think of Reagan as the person who's educated in a different kind of time frame when probably in more respects than certainly today, the founding ideas would have been discussed, debated, read as a young man. That would have been imbued him with, I think, his views of what America was all about. His young hero is Calvin Coolidge, whose speeches are filled with paeans to the founding fathers in a lot of ways. And many of you probably thought he never gave any speeches. I think in that sense, Reagan's very effective in and he's a product of history of the 20th century. So he knows from his own personal experiences in Hollywood about the threat of communism. He battled communism in the Screen Actors Guild in the late 40s and saw it as a threat to the labor union movement, but also to American democracy as well in that period. So I mean, he's somebody. I mean, is the most no presidents use history very correctly. Of course, that's what historians are for, to correct them about their misuse of that. But I think in many respects, what I like about Reagan's speeches is he does throw in the historical example. He does throw them in enough detail to keep it interesting. Certainly, maybe the details are wrong or at least overstretched, but they're there. And he does it in a fairly effective manner. I don't think it's overloaded with history. Certainly, he's no Lincoln in his use of rhetoric, but who is? And I think in many respects, Reagan is a very effective has very effective speech writers too, who write for him. But Reagan ultimately changes details to suit his own delivery and other things as well, as we know. So I mean, I don't know, I'm rambling, but I think that in many respects, I think his use of history is okay. He made up some things like Martin Treptow, the young man who died at World War One. And his use of Peggy Noonan's words at the D-Day site, the boys of Pointe du Hoc, very effective in that speech. So he's able to do it, and he has memories of that too, unlike a lot of presidents of that era.
Yeah, Reagan actually joked once that when there was a transition at the Treasury Department between, I think it was, I may have this wrong, between James Baker and Nicholas Brady as Treasury Secretary. He handed the keys to the Treasury to Brady, and he said something to the effect of, "Take good care of these. Alexander Hamilton gave me these keys himself." There is a passage in A Time for Choosing where Reagan says, quote, "The founding fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling people." And that, I have to say, I wish he had included a quote from Alexander Hamilton from the Federalist Papers, where Hamilton said, "The power over a man's subsistence is the power over a man's will." And that certainly that is a consistent theme, not only in The Time for Choosing, but throughout Reagan's public career the importance of property rights, which, and I believe there's a reference in here, I couldn't find it specifically about property, but that, may not sound perhaps all that dramatic to us, but after about 60 years of progressive thought, going back to Charles Beard and J. Allen Smith and others, all of whom were sort of very critical of the founding fathers for their what they believed was a kind of obsession with their own personal property and creating a government that was going to protect the rights of property elites in the futures. Reagan actually, kind of restored a renewed American sense of the importance of property rights, and that's something I think worthy of pointing out.
Yeah, and one of the passages where he mentions property rights comes on page 4, where he's talking about the growth of government bureaucracies. These proliferating bureaus with their thousands of regulations have cost us many of our constitutional safeguards. How many of us realize that today federal agents can invade a man's property without a warrant? They can impose a fine without a formal hearing, let alone a trial by jury, and they can seize and sell his property in auction to enforce the payment of that fine.
Thanks, David. That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
And just to build off here, great observations, Steve, about consistent messaging in Reagan from the time for choosing forward into his presidency and through the end of his presidency. If property rights, the centrality of property rights, is one messaging point that's consistent, what else stands out? Um, Reduction of taxation, um, the importance of the United States being a beacon of liberty and freedom.
The
Well,
growth of bureaucracy. Certainly, that's something that Reagan. What's the old joke? The worst words you want to hear. I'm from the government. I'm here to help.
that's
That's
right.
pretty consistent.
Yeah, we need, quote, we need true tax reform that will at least make a start toward restoring for our children the American dream that wealth is denied, the American dream that wealth is denied to no one, and that each individual has the right to fly as high as his strength and ability will take him. I mean, that could have been said by Reagan, and probably was in some form in 1989 in his
Yeah.
farewell address.
I think one thing too we see Reagan doing is using anecdotes over the course of his public life. If I'm not mistaken, the story he tells of the Cuban refugees who came to the United States, and someone commented, an American commented how lucky we are, and they said how lucky you are, how lucky we were to have a place to escape to. If I'm not mistaken, he uses that same story when speaking to the National Association of Evangelicals in 1983, the so-called Evil Empire speech. So that's almost 20 years later.
That's right.
And he's using that same story to illustrate what America stands for.
Yeah. Absolutely true, David. Yeah. He had a stock of stories, and even if the stories had been punctured repeatedly, even on some occasion by his own staff, he would still have a tendency to dip into them and use them. Look, Reagan had his critics would probably say a stubborn streak. Others might say he had a kind of admirable persistence. Uh, once he latched on to an idea, he stuck with it. I mean, you'd have to beat him off that idea with, you know, you'd really have to beat him up to get him off it. And then the downside of that, of course, was during the Iran-Contra affair, where he had convinced himself that he had not sold or had not exchanged arms for hostage. He finally was forced to admit that in one of his nationally televised speeches to the American public, where he, in a sense, apologized for the whole Iran-Contra affair. But then, within a few weeks, he was back to saying, in off-the-cuff remarks, that it had not been an exchange of arms for hostages.
Yeah, his ability to stay with his instincts, in some cases it didn't serve him well, in other cases it did. Perhaps his most famous speech besides this one, if we discount inaugural addresses, is the Berlin Wall speech. As it's been well established, the State Department really fought hard to get that line, tear down this wall, removed from the speech. And Reagan understood that the speech would live on, it would succeed only if that line were there. And that's again this consistent messaging, right? That this is, you cannot accommodate these walls, these barriers. Well, that brings us to the end of the hour, which has flown by. Thanks to Steve Knott and Greg Schneider for giving us such wonderful and informed insight into these documents, especially a time for choosing. And thanks to our participants for some great questions. Just a reminder about the email you will receive with a link for a certificate of participation. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center, which are also offered as part of our Masters of American History and Government program. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can also help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you'll receive by email next week. Share it with your colleagues and on social media. Finally, this is our last Documents in Detail webinar for the 2017-2018 school year. We'll set up again in August with another 10-episode season, again looking at a collection of documents drawn from our 50 Core American Documents volume. Information about the upcoming season, as well as our Saturday webinars, which will focus on great American debates for the next school year, can be found at this website, tah.org/webinars. Until then, good night. Thanks to Jeremy Gipton and Dennis and Ashland. And again, Steve and Greg, thanks for the edification and illumination. It's great
Thanks,
Thank you,
David.
speaking with you
David.
tonight.
Nice job, David.